Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me from Arkansas is my friend Evan Rothera. Evan, how are you this evening?
Very well. Thank you, Chris.
Excellent. Now, folks with ECW might not realize, but Evan does a little bit of work for us behind the scenes, doing some editorial capacities and stuff. He's an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith, and he's got a brand new book out, and I want to talk to him about it. So congratulations, first of all, Evan.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for talking to me. I always like the chance to talk to people about the book.
Always a pleasure. So the book is called Civil Wars and Reconstructions in America. I'll hold it up here and we'll see if it pops in or out here. Oh, see, there it goes. I'll make sure we have notes in the comments. But this talks about the Civil War in a broader global perspective that I think is really fascinating, because when most people think about the Civil War in a global perspective, they're thinking about British and French intervention. And instead, you're looking at the Southern Hemisphere. Tell us a little bit about the context of this fascinating book.
Absolutely. So you're absolutely right, Chris. I mean, when people think about the international nature of the Civil War, and Jack Green and Philip Morgan talked about this problem for Atlantic history more generally, they think in terms of east-west lines. So we look at the United States, Britain, France, maybe some other countries in Europe. But what I do is try and look at the north-south lines. So I think the first thing to say is, we know kind of when our Civil War is, 1861 to 1865 in this country. But what we often forget about is, there were a lot of other republics in the Americas who were going through their own growing pains, growth struggles, and they faced similar and as I argue, intertwined conflicts. So a couple years before our Civil War begins in Mexico, a group of liberals come to power. They overthrow Antonio Lopez de Santana. Right, this is the people like Benito Juarez, Juan Alvarez. They write a new constitution. This generates a conflict called the War of the Reform, which pits Mexican liberals against Mexican conservatives. That war is finishing about the same time our Civil War kicks off. But then Mexico's case becomes more complicated because Napoleon III, then the Emperor of France, gets involved. He starts colluding with Mexican conservatives. They try and place an Austrian archduke on the throne of a new Mexican empire. And that's what we call the French intervention. And that lasts until 1867. Now, at the other end of the hemisphere, Argentina, right, their conflict had really begun about the same time that they broke away from Spain. And it had pitted unitarios against federales, so Unitarians against Federalists. This had been going on for decades. But these wars of unifications wrap up literally just a very short period of time before the Civil War starts in the United States, while the War of the Reform is winding down in Mexico. And you could look at other countries in the Americas and say, well, there are other civil wars happening too. And that's certainly true. But, it's one book and you can't do everything. So one of the points that some people made, comparative studies are often two countries or two things or two regions, two states, whatever the case may be. My study looks at three so that it becomes sort of more broad than a book on the US Mexico, and I try to rope in the entire hemisphere. And so thinking about these interrelated struggles, and we can talk more about this, but one of the points I've found is that, it's not just that there's discrete civil wars and discrete conflicts occurring throughout the hemisphere. It's that people saw the projects these wars as interrelated. And so the liberals in Mexico, the Unitarians in Argentina, Republicans in the United States, they started to conceptualize themselves as a great liberal party of the world. And more than that, what they said is, these civil wars are so tremendously important because they pit democracy and republicanism on the one side against various forces of reaction, whether that's monarchy, aristocracy, autocracy of some kind. And it's easy for us to lose sight of this fact, but it's important to remember, today, democracy is almost the default mode of governance in the world. As people have said, even dictators sometimes see the use in wrapping themselves in democratic forms. But back then, it was not the default, right? The Americas were the exception. That was the locus of democracy and republicanism, that the entire hemisphere. And there were a lot of people throughout the world that desperately wanted to see these Republican experiments fail, and a lot of other people that wanted to see them succeed. So you see this fascinating cooperation, but well, I can develop any of these points, but I'll
and we're going to. I want to back up to something you said a second ago, which I think may make some of our listeners' heads spin, because you used the phrase Republicans saw themselves as a great liberal party. And in our modern parlance, Republicans and liberals don't necessarily go together. So let's take a second and sort of define our terms. And, as you talk about these forces of reactionaryism, conservatism, liberalism, unification. Who's who, and how does this all kind of fit together in a larger scheme of political thought?
That's a very good question. So liberals in Mexico, Unitarians in Argentina, Republicans in the United States, they're classic liberals in a sense, they're classically liberal.
And that means, in your book, that means what?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. Well, they favor, different types of individual liberty. In Mexico and in Argentina, a little bit less. You see a really pronounced church question. And one of the things Mexican liberals are trying to do is secularize the country, right? They want to reduce the power of the Catholic Church, so that involves taking a lot of education out of the hands of priests, taking power out of the hands of priests. They want to reduce the power of certain, what they see as reactionary groups in society. But a lot of these liberals are very interested in questions of national development too. They're all almost obsessed with internal improvement. So in the tradition of the Whig Party in the United States and the Federalists, even some Democrats too, they want to develop their railroad grids. They want to develop canals. They want to develop the internal infrastructure. There's a darker side too, because all these groups are also interested, and I don't develop this at great length in the book, but other scholars have, at kind of reducing the power of indigenous groups in their countries. And they do kind of take notes from each other in that regard. So they're interested, in a lot of, in Mexico's case in particular, it's about a lot of secularization, reducing the power of the church, what they see as reactionary groupings, developing the country, tying each other together, increasing access to markets, things like that.
Oh, very good. And so, as you kind of situate that in the unification in Argentina, where there's this coming together of individual entities, and I see that a lot like the notion of the union, which takes precedent over the individual states. Am I on the right track there?
Yes, okay. Very much so. And, a lot of the debates that we would talk about in the United States during the early republic crop up in these countries as well. So, how much power should the federal government have relative to the states? And a lot of liberals, they are in Mexico, they're extreme federalists, which means they are the guys who came, sort of age during the crucible of Santana's centralization, where all power was, lodged at the center. They don't want that. They want very powerful states. Now, once they get into power at the federal level, they discover maybe not quite so federalist, but in Argentina, it's the same question, how much power, and Argentina has provinces, not state, how much power should provinces have relative to the state governments? And, you see that question in the US too. And we often talk about this notion of state rights, how federalist do we want the states to be? And Republicans and Democrats in the 1850s and 1860s and before, they don't always make it easy to try and say, well, one party was very federalist and one wasn't, because it really depends on what issue you're talking about specifically, So you do see a lot of similarities, and you do see people who are not just looking inward, and I think that's an important point, right? The historian Robert Wiebe once said, one of the great transformations of the post-Civil War US was that what he called island communities started fracturing. And, he said when that happened, people started to gain a greater sense of the world. But I think what transnational history shows us is that, especially in the early republic, during the Civil War, people had that understanding. They were self-consciously thinking about themselves alongside other people. They were, well, as we'll see, actually participating in other conflicts. So I'm not sure it's so much island communities as, people have a more robust sense of, well, world affairs than even we do today. And our world's in some ways far more connected because of technology.
Yeah, that thought that these three conflicts are related and they're part of a broader global struggle, I think would be illuminating to a lot of people, which is one reason why I think the book is so fascinating. This whole different way of situating what's going on in America, which we have always tended to see as North versus South, as something that's really part of this larger global sweep that's going on.
It is. And as with so many things, Lincoln helps us kind of understand in some ways. When he debates Stephen Arnold Douglas for the Senate in 1858, at one point he's very eloquent. He said, there's a great issue in this debate, and it's one that's been going on for a while, and it'll go on long after the poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself have fallen silent. And what he boils it down to is, the divine right of kings versus the common right of humanity. So he taps into this larger idea, and that's what people at the time are doing too. And again, in Lincoln's phrase from his message to Congress in 1862, he talks about the Civil War as a last best hope of earth. And what he means is there's a lot riding on this conflict for a number of reasons, not least of which many people, and he would say in Europe, look to the United States. The revolutions in 1848 that failed, you have a lot of people still inspired by that. They want to see the US succeed because they want republicanism to show that it can weather this kind of conflict. And what I would say is, if we tweak Lincoln's thought a little bit, it's not that our conflict or Mexico's or Argentina's was the last best hope of earth. It's that they're all last best hopes of earth in their own right. They're all linked together almost inextricably.
Yeah. Another term that you use that I kind of chuckled at is you refer to the so-called Confederacy. Tell me about your framing of that.
That's fair. That's Lincoln's framing, which I follow. So what Lincoln would say is, well, the Confederacy as a nation never truly existed. He always saw the Civil War, it's purely an internal rebellion. And in fact, US diplomats, Lincoln got pretty irritated with Britain when it looked like they were flirting with recognizing the Confederacy, when the Queen's, proclamation may have given the Confederates belligerent status. And people get really tweaked when Gladstone, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think, said, Jefferson Davis is building armies, build a navy. It looks like he's building a nation too. People are quite upset about that. So I kind of, again, follow Lincoln. I don't necessarily see the Confederacy as a nation, just casting it in terms of an internal rebellion, which, and you see this throughout the Americas, is often how people cast these type of rebellions.
Right. And I think that that's important context then compared to what's going on in Mexico and Argentina in your book, where you've got internal strife versus country. And yes. I think that makes those parallels a lot more instructive for us, particularly then when we do have foreign intervention that pops its way into Mexico.
Absolutely. And that's a great point, and we have these internal struggles. And in Mexico's is fascinating too. I mean, people didn't, they didn't even have to work to make it fit the model they created, because you had a French emperor with an Austrian archduke and a bunch of, foreign European soldiers who were colluding with Mexican conservatives to try and topple a legitimately elected government and put, literally a European aristocrat on the throne of a new Mexican empire. But Mexico is also the place where you see the most explicit foreign intervention. I mean, as much as Britain may have played footsies with the Confederacy, they never crossed that line. And of course, Napoleon wasn't going to move in the United States unless he was darn sure that Britain was going to, But the interesting thing too, and other historians have developed this, Europe, I say Europe generally, but Spain, France, Britain to a lesser extent, they really do take advantage of the United States falling into civil war to try and muscle their way back into the Americas. So Ann Eller talks about, how Spain tried to reconquer the Dominican Republic. There's the War of the Pacific. There are other examples too of Europe basically saying, well, we think the United States is distracted enough that we can probably get away with this. But it's also instructive too, once our Civil War ends, I mean, then the question that a lot of people in the country face is, well, what do we want to do? And they think specifically about France and Mexico, but Spain kind of runs out of the Dominican Republic pretty quickly. It's not to say that the US is the only actor here. I mean, obviously Mexicans and Dominicans played a huge role in repelling what happened here, but once our Civil War ends, Europe has to confront a new situation.
Yeah, I thought it was rather interesting that Spain goes into the Dominican Republic when the U.S. isn't looking, and the Dominicans manage to drive them out. But it's almost like, we're going to pick this fight while Big Brother's not looking, and oh wait, Big Brother's looking all of a sudden.
Exactly. Yes. And so one of the fascinating points here too, we think, well, this is all covered sort of under the umbrella of the Monroe Doctrine. But during this period, I mean, how many European powers respected? And for anybody that needs a quick refresher, this was the 1820s when the Monroe Doctrine was issued. It was basically a statement written by John Quincy Adams, but then folded into President Monroe's annual message saying, look, European systems of government are incompatible with ours. This is sort of close to the end of the Spanish American Revolution. So we see this new bumper crop of republics, and the fear is Europe will try and pounce on them, especially the Holy Alliance. So Monroe said, well, we want you to stay out of our hemisphere, and it's a unilateral declaration. But one of the things I trace in the book is how especially Mexicans seize on the Monroe Doctrine, and they craft this language of sister republics, which had existed in the 1820s, but had fallen into disuse. And there's numerous examples of Mexicans saying, hey, sister republic shouldn't be sitting idle while, this happens. And people in the US really respond to that. There's this very strong concerted push to do something to help Mexico. And it varied by person what that meant. But, so you really see kind of an evolution of the Monroe Doctrine in a pretty important way during this period.
So for listeners who maybe know Mexico as Napoleon III and Maximilian and something might have happened, give us a little refresher. Why is the conflict in Mexico? What is the conflict in Mexico, and why is it important to the United States at this period?
Okay.
And then we'll shift gears, and I'll pitch that same question to you about Argentina, which I think people probably know less about. But let's look at Mexico for just a second.
Yes, I have a feeling you're right about it. It's what I've what I have found. So Mexico, like I said, I think if you want to understand Mexican history, you need to know something about Antonio Lopez de Santana. And we think of him, the great dictator, right? He's widely reviled among Mexicans. He loses Texas, he then bungles badly during the US war with Mexico. During the early 1850s, it's one of his many periods of, well, he left, then he came back. He entered into what was his most overt dictatorship. And so this lasted only a couple of years, but it generated this fierce opposition among, again, this burgeoning group of liberals who are mostly federalists who despise his centralism. So he's actually defeated and pretty much ushered out of the country very quickly. And then, like I said, liberals, they write the Constitution of 1857. That sparks the War of the Reform. So at its heart, right, that conflict is a question about what should Mexico look like, and for liberals, like I was saying, we need a more secular powers in the state. We don't want the church in charge of education. We want to secularize marriage, right? So they're trying to cut down the church's power. They're trying to cut down the army's power, right? They want to reduce those privileges. But of course, you can imagine, especially among the church and the army, there's some pretty, fervent pushback. But liberals also try and break up communal land holdings in indigenous populations. So the people who are fighting against them are not just, disaffected army officers and angry priests who've lost their signatures. A lot of indigenous people, they don't see liberalism as offering much for them. So it is a civil war. And you can say, well, the liberals are an emerging middle class, but both sides pull from sort of all levels of society. And the War of the Reform ends with Mexican conservatives being defeated. Benito Juarez is back in power in Mexico City, but it's been a pretty costly war. The Mexican treasury is in shambles. So what Juarez says is we have to suspend payments on our foreign debts. And this is where Napoleon starts to get some schemes. So he and Britain and Spain, they initially intervene in Mexico, right? And they seize the Veracruz Customs House. They start using that customs revenue to service their debt. And Spain and Britain really just wanted to be paid. France, on the other hand, that's when Napoleon starts thinking, well, why don't we just take more than customs revenue? So they land men, they start marching overland, right? They get to Puebla. There they encounter kind of a smaller ragtag army led by a lawyer turned general named Ignacio Zaragoza. If you were betting during that period, right? France, this is not that long after Napoleon, the actual original Napoleon, not his nephew. France is still regarded as one of the preeminent military powers. So everybody thought, well, they'll just steamroll over Mexico. But they lose at the Battle of Puebla, and that's what's commemorated in today's Cinco de Mayo, or the 5th of May. Now, this is important for the United States, some scholars have said, because it basically keeps the French out of Mexico City for another year, right? If they had gotten there sooner, then all of a sudden the war in the Southwest, our Civil War, Texas, the borderlands, that then becomes a much more open question about, well, what if France and the imperialists actually decided to get involved up in there? And how does that go? It's counterfactual, we don't know, but is an interesting question. So, there's, again, this concerted liberal resistance. They're eventually driven out of Mexico City. So Juarez and his government, they retreat well into the north. There's some fascinating kind of points of overlap between them and US forces. So all this matters, right? Because at its heart, what Napoleon has done here is it's a flagrant violation of the Monroe Doctrine. And it's basic. I mean, he gives the back of his hand to the US and he says, what are you going to do, right? You're tearing yourself apart in a civil war. He gambles that they won't do anything, and he gambles that he can win in Mexico. What he did not predict is a couple things. A, this fervent Mexican resistance that leads Maximilian to eventually issue something called the Black Decree, which any liberal or person seized in arms would be executed within 24 hours. Napoleon obviously didn't foresee the North winning. He thought the Confederacy, he was betting his horse on that one. That didn't work out. So eventually that ends. But why this is so important kind of for the United States and for Mexico, again, people see these two conflicts as interrelated, but the US has to think practically. Supposing, well, two outcomes. If the Civil War winds down in favor of the North and Napoleon is still in Mexico, that completely screws up the geopolitics of the Americas. And Grant says to Andrew Johnson, our Civil War does not end while the French are still in Mexico, right? Yeah. He's very explicit about that point. But then somebody said, well, what if the Civil War had ended with Confederate independence? Then you have an even more possibly odd situation in the Americas. I mean, how would the Confederates have dealt with the French in Mexico, vice versa? What would have happened in the North? Somebody said you could see the US splitting into 5 or 6 different nations. The Pacific Coast flakes off, the Midwest leaves, there goes New England, who knows? But it's so important because of the possibilities it presents. And again, I would say because people saw the interrelated nature of these conflicts, and they really did see themselves as sister republics fighting the forces of reaction, And what it also suggests is that maybe scholars have not overemphasized, but overplayed the extent of anti-Latin Americanism during this period, right? There's far more, I would say, cooperation and far more willingness to work with people.
Now, one quick question before we shift to Argentina. How much credence do you give those, again, if I'm checking down the few things most people know about Mexico during the American Civil War, it's like, oh, there was the overtures where the Confederacy and the Union would get together and kick Maximilian out. How much credence do you give to any of that?
It's a very good question. And I mean, the most famous example is our favorite old Jacksonian, Francis Preston Blair Sr. He makes a trip to Richmond and he tries to convince Jefferson Davis that, well, you can take your entire army, go to Mexico, expel the French. You'll be a hero, and Mexico will be the safety valve to bleed off angry rebels who don't want to, well, So that does happen. Blair, it's lesser known, but then a couple weeks later, he says to Lincoln, what if we got Garibaldi in here to command the Mexican armies? Which is, who knew? It's fascinating. What I think is instructive is that there was this expectation among a lot of soldiers, North and South, that this might actually happen, So I don't think the likelihood of the US sending, not demobilizing the army, but sending the entire thing down to the borderlands is highly unlikely. But Grant did send Sheridan and 50,000 soldiers to Texas, ostensibly to patrol the borders, but really it was to tell the imperialists and the French, hey, you put one toe out of line and well, Phil ran havoc in the Shenandoah Valley. You want him coming down and, teaching you the same lessons? So like, it's a great question. And a lot of people did want to see it happen, which I think is kind of instructive in a way too, that you had this widespread sentiment that we should, the United States should do something. And of course, the problem for Lincoln is, well, we don't want to call an armistice and not solve the Civil War and just send both armies down to Mexico. It wasn't practical so far as he saw it. What would Lincoln have done if he had lived is a good question. Andrew Johnson, we think, usually gets locked into the focusing on the domestic side of Reconstruction, but he's not enforcing the Neutrality Acts. He's allowing people to cross the border. He's allowing Mexicans to recruit. He locks down the border into Canada, right? So he'll prosecute the Fenians, Irish nationalists who tried to raise a rebellion in Canada. But he's not interested in stopping that on the southern border, which again suggests that a lot of people, had a vested interest in making this happen.
Those unruly Canadians. Oh heavens. So let's shift to the southern hemisphere in Argentina, which I find fascinating. That was the part about your book I found most interesting because it's the piece I knew the least about. And there's a lot going on down there. Give us the quick Cliff's Notes version.
Well, I'll do my best. There's
Right.
probably
I mean, it took you a whole book to explain. Give it to me in 2 minutes. Yeah.
in one concise paragraph. So basically, like I said, Argentina's problem grows out of the wars of unification. And there's a dictatorial figure in Argentina too, Juan Manuel de Rosas, who was a longtime governor of Buenos Aires. And what he did is he created alliances with regional strongmen who we call caudillos, right? So there's this discontented, anti-caudillo resistance, men like Domingo F. Sarmiento. This drags on, for decades. In 1852, he's defeated at the Battle of Caseros, right, by, a group of, they're really a polyglot army. There's Brazilians, there's people from Uruguay, there's exiles that came back, they throw them out of power, but then the problem for a lot of people is the leader of this group, Justo José de Urquiza. He almost seems to them like a new dictatorial figure. So the problem then for about another decade is, well, how does Buenos Aires fit into this Argentine Confederation? And there's several battles fought over that. And then in 1861, at the Battle of Pavon, the question is answered. They defeat the forces of the Confederation and a new republic is formed. So Argentina, it's a much longer time frame in some ways than the other two countries. And what it shows is, ironically, Argentina was one of the earliest countries to produce a Declaration of Independence, break away from Spain, and yet it has this lengthy, war of unification. Again, fought about some of the issues we've talked about earlier. And it's the same sort of questions that come up in the United States. Again, what power does the federal government have relative to, in this case, the provincial governments? How should the federal government pacify discontented people in the interior? So their struggle ends while the U.S. Civil War is just about to begin. And so what I try to do in the book is show, especially in the early pacification period, I mean, they're doing sort of a lot of the same things you see there. They're coming across the same questions. And again, people like Sarmiento and Mitre see themselves as very much, moving along the same paths, fighting the same battles, engaged in the same kind of struggles and trying to answer the same questions as people in the United States.
You start the book really kind of in the beginning of 1863, and Lincoln's had a rough time of it. Juarez has had a tough time of Mexico. And then apparently things seem to be kind of settling into some sort of rhythm in Argentina, and Lincoln gets this letter. And that sort of is the opening move for you to begin discussing all of these things. Why did you choose that particular moment as a moment to shed some light on how all these things interrelate?
It's an interesting question. I liked it. It's a nice, vivid anecdote. So Lincoln does get a letter from Bartolome Mitre. He sends one back. It's a congratulations basically on being elected president, on Argentina wrapping up its war. What I thought is, we could start with just Lincoln and Juarez, but again, one of the points of the book is what happens when we, broaden a comparative study beyond two countries. So you do have Argentina at kind of a different moment in here. And I think for me, the interesting thing is, as you mentioned, as I say in the book, I mean, at that point, things are going badly for the North. I mean, Lincoln and his party have just been, let's say, trounced in the 1862 midterms. I mean, Antietam, yes, it was a tactical victory. Yes, it lets him issue the Emancipation Proclamation, but he was furious because he thought McClellan could have, won that Napoleonic victory against Lee. Then we have Fredericksburg, which is a disaster. Bragg invades Kentucky. Yes, he's repelled, but it's still, caused a lot of problems in people's mind. Stones River, very narrow victory, right? So, he's not in a good place militarily. He's not in a good place politically. Juarez, by this point, knows that the French are coming back. He's going to be leaving Mexico City in a couple months. So neither country is doing well in their respective conflicts. But here we have another part of the Americas where the third country is. So I thought, kind of starting from that point and then using that letter as a way to tie them together, serve some of the larger points I was trying to make in the book.
There's also a really interesting point that you make, as we're talking about these forces of liberalism versus reactionarism and authoritarianism, and Joe Hooker pops up in a way that kind of symbolizes some of these global tides in a person that Lincoln has to deal with in a very direct sort of way. Tell me about Joe Hooker's role kind of as a symbol in this book.
I will. So for some of your listeners, readers may know, but what is Hooker's role at this point? Well, the Army of the Potomac is not in a particularly great shape, right? They've been mauled a couple of times. I mean, Lincoln calls hope from the West. He, of course, issues the kind of proclamation you never want to issue, right? I come to you from the West where we've only seen the backs of our enemies, and then Second Bull Run happens. The Fitzjohn Porter question. Antietam, you can say it's a victory, but a lot of people felt it was a missed opportunity. Fredericksburg, of course, they say it was a mismanaged disaster. There's the Mud March where Burnside tries to take them south, and that ends in just mockery and humiliation. So the Army's not doing so well. So what Lincoln has to do is find someone who can try and, rebuild, reforge the Army, reinstill that esprit de corps. And he finally settles on Hooker, which is a bit of a controversial choice. Someone said Hooker's headquarters were a combination of barroom and brothel. So he had that hard drinking, hard living reputation. But Hooker had engaged in some dangerously loose talk about a dictatorship, right? That the military should take charge of things, put a dictator in, and fix the problem. And of course, two guesses about who Joe Hooker thought that dictator might be. And so Lincoln faces, a challenge where the guy he thinks is probably the best one for the job has been talking about overthrowing the government and putting a dictator in power. So he writes this letter to Hooker, basically saying to the effect, I've heard you were talking about dictatorships. Only successful generals can create dictatorships. So bring me the successes and I'll worry about the dictatorship. But the point I make there is it's kind of a funny story from our perspective, especially because, we know Hooker's wouldn't have been successful enough to bring off a dictatorship, and Chancellorsville, of course, is going to reveal his limits. But there's other places in the Americas that had a very profound, very unpleasant experience with dictatorship, Mexico among them, right? A lot of this was reaction against Santana. And so Lincoln is trying to disarm Hooker, but if he cast his eyes about the Americas, I mean, he would see this is something more than just dangerously loose talk. There's an impulse here that has been brought to fruit in other places. And I mean, Mark Neely made this point a long time ago. When you look at the soldiers in their winter encampments during that period, this is when the Democrats had taken control of legislatures in Illinois and Indiana, and Neely found regiment after regiment just sending resolutions to Richard Yates in Illinois, the governor, and Governor Morton in Indiana saying, just give us the word. We'll come up there and we'll clean the legislature out, right? I mean, this is, Pride's Purge from the English Civil War, except on steroids. And now that never went anywhere. But the point I'm making is, there's a lot of stuff like that burbling beneath the surface. And sometimes it can seem just sort of random if we look at it from a strictly, sort of domestic perspective. But when you put that into a larger international context, you see, again, the US is facing the same kind of problems and conundrums that other countries are.
Yeah. And we've been talking about the armed conflicts here and sort of their context with each other. When things start to quiet down on the battlefields in America and then in Mexico, uh, we get into a lot of political turmoil that is in many ways even more tumultuous than what was happening on the battlefield, at least from a nation building point of view. How do things start to shake out for these three countries as they sort of try to navigate their own post-war existences?
It's a great question. And one of the points we often hear is, well, our reconstruction is so fill in the word, mild, lenient, harsh, whatever school you're reading. And the question for us should always be, well, how did you come to that kind of impression? Harsh, mild, lenient, relative to what precisely? So one of the things I try and illustrate in the book is, all right, we have these civil wars. Mexico's is the latest. It's ended by 1867. The French have been expelled. The Austrians are gone. Maximilian is executed at Querétaro. What happens then? And each country faces the same problem. How do we knit society back together, but ultimately in a way to stop something like this kind of destructive conflict from ever happening again? And so you see, right, in the early years, there's the pacification, and I described that for Argentina. You see occupations of various kinds. But what you also see, I would say, are the growing seeds of discontent that have been planted, right? And they're going to flower in various ways, whether that's sort of small scale, decentralized, what would look like random violence if you took one instance, but you start to see more and more of it, to the paramilitary violence, things like overthrowing legislatures. And so what I try to do is put the three countries up against each other and say, well, if we look at kind of these three periods, the early years of Reconstruction, then basically Grant's first term, and then Grant's second term through 1880. What conclusions can we draw? And what I found is, generally in terms of in the early years, Argentina seems to be the best in terms of suppressing the violence and the insurgency. Right. When you get into that period of Grant's first term, I mean, my conclusion is that governments do still maintain a monopoly on coercive force, that they can put down these violent episodes. Right. So if there are rebellions, if there's violence, if there's paramilitary terrorism like the Klan, the government can intervene to stop it. The problem comes for the United States in particular with the panic, an economic panic in 1873. All of a sudden, it's bad times, Republicans, the party in power, so they get punished. There's less and less political will to stop things, right? And in Mexico, you start to see, again, some of the similar problems. I would say Argentina is consistently the best about these types of pacifications. The problem, especially for the United States and Mexico, is, well, as time endures, you got people that want to move on. You don't have the political will to do this. So 1876, the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes wins by one electoral vote. There's also an election in Mexico that sparks yet another rebellion by Porfirio Diaz when he seems to lose. He ends up basically overthrowing the duly elected government and seizing power through the pronunciamiento. Hayes wins the presidency, but by that point, the Republicans have made, a Faustian bargain. We'll let the elite, Southern elite, take care of your states. Just, we got to stop. They see Reconstruction as a superating wound at this point, and they've got to find new issues. And in Argentina, there's a presidential election in 1874 that results in rebellion. It's suppressed. The people who are involved in it are generally amnestied or punished very lightly. But again, I would say the government has, the ability to do that because they've been the most aggressive about suppressing that kind of thing. So my ultimate conclusion is, when you look at these violent episodes, by 1880, each of the three countries has found itself on a similar path to a type of order, right? And this order usually involves disfranchising large sectors of the population. So in the US, that's going to be Jim Crow in the South, obviously, although Jim Crow is not just a Southern phenomenon, as we know. In Argentina, that's going to be the rise of something called El Orden Conservador, or the conservative order, which is basically an oligarchy that'll run the country until, 1916. And then in Mexico, it's the start of something called the Porfiriato, which is Porfirio Diaz being president almost continuously through the early years of the Mexican Revolution. So kind of what I say is the bargain people end up making is that we want order, we want stability, and they're willing to give up, as it turns out, quite a lot to achieve that, you know.
Now, and I'll oversimplify this, but I also have always thought that, one reason for Reconstruction's failure too is America is fascinated by the shiny, glittery thing that is the West, and sort of our attention gets drawn to the taming of the West. And so, like, let's not pay attention to that, hard, complicated Reconstruction stuff going on. We've got shiny new. Um, do Mexico or Argentina have any of those sort of similar dynamics, or is that something that's kind of unique to us?
I would say there's some similar dynamics. If you cast it in terms of sort of government action against indigenous people, as in Argentina, there were campaigns earlier in the century about the tail end of the period I look at is the start of something called La Conquista del Desierto, or the conquest of the desert. And that does involve prolonged government fighting against indigenous peoples, not unlike the winning of our own West, so to speak. Mexico, in turn, is also waging some struggles against indigenous people. And what they would say is, sort of banditry and lawlessness more generally. So you can, I think, see some analogs in each of the three countries. And like I said, there's some, someone could say more about comparative indigenous policy, for instance.
Right.
So you do see that. I think your broader point too, people getting distracted from Reconstruction or reconstructions in each of the three countries is a good one. And ultimately, whether it's distraction, whether they got sick of it, whether they wanted to move on to something else, whether they got tired of it, it all combines to just cause a lot of people to say, we're done with it.
Yeah.
We want to basically move on. And that's why, or the order and stability becomes so seductive, because, the Reconstruction years did feature a lot of disorder and instability caused by angry members of the vanquished groups, who are trying to destabilize their reconstructions and roll the clock back to a point where they're back in charge.
Yeah. Yeah. My sense was that it's not necessarily a very happy ending to your story. I mean, not that you're, storytelling in a traditional sort of sense, but, going back to your phrase earlier about this Faustian bargain, and, that's how we kind of come through these reconstructions is by making those sorts of devil's deals.
It's a sad thing. It is not, no, the last chapter of the book does not end happy. Now, my initial epilogue was somewhat darker in tone, so I did revise
Oh boy.
it. What I tried to say there is, yes, we have this situation, these civil wars are interrelated, right? By the 1880s, each country's on a similar path to order, but what kind of larger lessons can we extract from this? And one of my points is it shows us, that a lot of people at the time rejected isolationism, rejected kind of either anti-Latin Americanism or anti-US sentiment, saw themselves as engaged in shared projects, privileged cooperation. So we do have some important lessons that we can draw from this. And, as somebody said, history doesn't have to be inspiring to be instructive, but I think you can see a little bit of, maybe more than a little bit of both, sort of throughout the book. So yes, the chapter where I basically end with the elections of 1880. No, if you stop there, it wouldn't be a very happy feeling. But I think if you continue through the epilogue, you hopefully come out of it on a slightly more positive note.
So let me, and this is sort of backing us way, way up. So what got you interested in this topic in the first place?
That's a long story. I'll try to condense it. When I was an undergrad at Gettysburg, I double majored in history and Spanish, and one of the requirements was spend a semester abroad. So I went to Mendoza in Argentina, and I was taking an Argentine social history class, among others, at the Universidad Nacional de Cuyo. And I came across just a very brief mention, and I can't even tell you what I was reading at that point. They mentioned, and then Domingo Sarmiento wrote a biography of Abraham Lincoln. And I said, what was that? So I started looking into this, and I wondered, well, I know a little bit about Sarmiento, but never heard of this. When did he write it? It was 1865. I'm like, okay, well, that seems to be kind of interesting. So why did he write this biography? And that was my initial foray into the subject. So the early design of this project was that it would be comparative US and Argentina. But as I was getting more and more into my program at Penn State, Bill Blair said, you should really add Mexico. And it complicated things, but he was right. I mean, it works better as a 3-country study. So basically this stretches back to 2008 when I was in Argentina, and kind of that started a fascination there. And I addressed Sarmiento obviously a lot in this book, and I wrote a chapter about him for David Pryor's book on international reconstructions. And so I've been fascinated with him for a while. And, among other things, he's rushing to get this biography out. And as Robert May and others have said, I mean, this kind of sets, well, a lot of Latin American perceptions about Lincoln for several generations. So it's a tremendously influential but often overlooked book. And so I feel like I'll return to that at some point in the future as well. So that's where the initial interest came from. And, it evolved and grew over time as I did the research.
I got to tell you, I hear this a lot, and I'm sure you do too. Like, what else is there to write about the Civil War?
Oh my gosh.
And this is a book that was illuminating to me. Here's something new to say about the Civil War. I really appreciated it because it took away stuff that really opened my eyes about that larger context. So I congratulate you on that.
Well, thank you. And yes, you're right. You've heard it 10 gajillion times, and I'm sure people, what more can we write about the Civil War? What more can we write about Lincoln? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot, and that's what I tell students. There's still a heck of a lot to be said, and stuff that needs to be said. So you should, well, my advice is, always to write about what you want to write about, but, know that, yeah, there's a lot that's been written about the Civil War, sure, but there's still more to be said. So Thank you for that.
Yeah, sure. So is there anything I haven't asked you that I should have tonight?
Ooh, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Is there?
All right. So it'll be like 2 a.m. and you'll be like, oh, I should have. Yeah, that's,
Yeah, I'm sure when we're done, I'll think, oh, I should get that. Yeah, but no, I thought comprehensive and thorough.
Very good. So the book is Civil Wars and Reconstructions in the Americans, United States, Mexico, and Argentina by Evan Rothera from LSU Press. I encourage you to pick it up. I promise you will see the war in a different perspective. So Evan, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, I'm sorry. You're welcome. And thank you for agreeing to do this.
My privilege. We'll see you folks online and on the battlefield.